Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Tom Davenport, who has been a thought leader in the area of technology and business for several decades. Tom has written a number of books, including his latest bestseller, All In on AI, where the title says it all. The way I see it, if you're a business leader, you're either all in on AI, or you're going to go out of business. Tom is also a distinguished professor at Babson College, a fellow at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and a visiting professor at the Oxford Said School of Business. Last but not least, he's a senior advisor to Deloitte's AI practice. Clearly, his tentacles spread far and wide. It's always fun talking to him. Tom, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Vasant. Great to be here.
Before we get started, just say a few words, Tom, or more than a few words. Introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us what your journey's been like until now.
Well, that would take the first hour, I think, but I was academically trained as a sociologist, and over time I got more and more interested in computing. I had some jobs helping people do their statistical computing when I was in graduate school, and more interested in computing, less interested in academic sociology. So I decided I was going to go to business school, and I got into one of the schools I wanted to go to. It was MIT, but 2 weeks before I decided to take a job that would have been the job I wanted when I got out, a consulting job with a IT strategy boutique. But even then I gravitated toward research. And so I've been moving back and forth between business schools and consulting firms ever since, doing, quote, thought leadership in consulting and doing practitioner-oriented research and writing and teaching in business schools.
So, Tom, between you and I, we've got several decades of familiarity and experience with AI in the business world.
Not me. I'm much, much younger than you are, Vasant.
Yeah, well, that's why I didn't talk about the breakdown. But nevertheless, I was speaking at a conference several years ago, and a friend of mine introduced me as a pracademic, and I thought, well, that's fair. That was a fair way to describe me, and that's certainly the way I look at you. You had sort of one foot in each world, or maybe you want to describe it differently, but you've been sort of an academic and very much in the practical world of business. We've been talking about AI for a long time. I recall a few events where we've spoken, but does something feel different now? Like, has AI finally maybe arrived? Just given what we're seeing with this Chat GPT-3, which everyone seems to be talking about.
Yeah, I think it has achieved critical mass, and I don't see how we could ever go back to another AI winter. We could have, I suppose, a small cold snap here and there, but a full season of winter, I think, is highly unlikely. And I think all the generative AI stuff is part of it. But there's just so much activity going on in big companies and startups, and I just don't see it going away anytime soon. And I think one could argue, I did a lot of work on analytics before I rediscovered AI 5 or 6 years ago, and this is really just an extension of what we were doing with analytics in a way. I mean, predictive analytics and straightforward, simple versions of machine learning are basically the same thing. So I think amount of data is not going to decline anytime soon. The need to make sense of it isn't going to go away. So yes, I think it's here for good, fortunately.
But I just want to stay with this Chat GPT-3 for a minute, because almost everyone I know, but actually not almost everyone I know, just seems to be blown away by it. It just seems different. And if I think about it, and I wrote about this in my last newsletter, is it too much to say that machines finally seem to be understanding us, as opposed to us talking to them in a very sort of restricted manner through GUIs and, poking and prodding to sort of get what we want, right? It's just we've never really had a machine that could understand us.
Well, of course, technically, it doesn't understand anything.
I was afraid
just,
you might say that.
It's just making a statistical prediction based on the data upon which it has been trained. So, and I think it does have some things in common with human to human dialogue, in that the response you get back is highly influenced by how you phrase the question or phrase the prompt, so to speak. And we humans, I think, would probably benefit from what I argue everybody should do with ChatGPT and other generative technologies, which is edit very carefully what comes out. And I guess it lies like humans in many ways. I love the fact that I think it was a New York Times reporter who said to ChatGPT, "Tell me about the great Indiana-Ohio War," and it went off into a detailed discussion of that war, which of course never existed. So there are some things in common, but I think we do have to remember that it is just sort of predicting the next word on the basis of what's come in the past and what it's been trained upon. I don't think it's sentient, although in a way, that guy at Google who said that Lambda, Google's sort of earlier version of a generative technology, was sentient, he probably wouldn't have been fired if he'd waited a little while, worked for OpenAI, and said that ChatGPT-3 was sentient.
True. Yeah, Blake Lemoine. By the way, he has a great talk on YouTube on
I'll look
this
for
thing
that. I haven't seen that.
from several years ago. I think he gave a talk at the law school at Stanford. But to sort of stick with GPT-3 just for a few minutes more, right? So my own experience and my own introduction to AI occurred because I was watching this physician talking to a system at the University of Pittsburgh. He was discussing a case, and at one point, the computer asked him a question, and he said, "Why are you asking me the question?" And the computer said, "Well, because the evidence you've given me so far is consistent with these hypotheses, and this question will help me discriminate between the top two." And that just blew me away. This was 1979 at the University of Pittsburgh, a computer connected to, a terminal connected to a computer at Stanford. But when I think of that interaction, it was occurring in very restricted kinds of terms, right? I mean, the expert had to specify the input so that the machine could understand it in terms of a command line. The computer may have, asked him for the condition of the lungs, and instead of saying, "Here it is, scan it and see for yourself," he had to sort of describe that there were lesions on the top right. And so, when I think back to where we've come in these 40 years and all of these attempts at sort of natural language understanding that sort of failed miserably, I just can't but help feel that there's something new been accomplished here. And yes, these language models don't really, quote unquote, understand anything, if you go back to sort of Searle's Chinese room experiment. But, doesn't really matter, right? I mean, if they simulate understanding and we can't tell the difference anymore, I mean, that seems, I don't know, maybe my expectations are really low, but that just seems to have taken us to a whole new level of capability where the interface with the computer, which has always, in my mind, been a big sort of source of impedance or friction, is finally giving way, right? That we're actually beginning to get the computer to talk to us on our own terms in terms of sort of what we perceive and so on? Or am I sounding like science fiction?
Well, I think you're right that it's great progress. And, talking about the past, I remember I was quite impressed the first time I saw Eliza, Joe Weizenbaum's sort of computational therapist. What was that, 30 years ago or so?
Longer, like
And
776. Yeah.
okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't. Maybe I saw it 30 years ago, but I forget when it was developed. But it was a very restricted domain, and I think part of the astounding thing about ChatGPT and the other generative tools is the breadth of kind of knowledge, I guess you can say, that they can address. I still think it certainly falls short of artificial general intelligence, but it's certainly moving in that direction. And I think it has probably, there are all these predictions about when AGI will come. And for the most part, even among really smart AI experts, there was a certain conservatism, 70 years, 100 years. I think on average, there was a book that addressed that, and the average was like 75 years or something. And I'm guessing that this has accelerated people's sense of when AGI will actually get here, because at certain times it does feel like AGI to use these tools. However, if you think that there's something really generally intelligent there, you're going to be disappointed because it's going to screw up more frequently than a real intelligent system would do.
Yeah, true, very, very true. In fact, in the 80s, people used to say AI is what hasn't been done yet. Whenever something is solved, it's not AI anymore because you solved it. You have an algorithm, so that's not AI.
Yeah, like OCR. Nobody thinks of OCR, optical character recognition, as AI anymore, but at one point it was clearly an AI problem.
True. I mean, it's sort of the basis for perception. So Tom,
But
let's
the other thing, before we leave this topic, I think it also illustrates what we've been seeing for the last decade or so, which is that you were talking about natural language processing, and that was for a long time mostly sort of based on semantics and computational linguistics, based on the relationships between terms and phrases and sentences and so on. And what we found in almost every aspect of AI is that the statistical paradigm ends up being a lot more powerful than the kind of semantics or logic based. I do think that I'm sure that system that you saw at Pitt was rule based, and I do think that there is still a place for that. And I see it all the time. Companies are still using those rule based systems in some ways for relatively simple problems, but for really complex problems, nothing beats a lot of data and a complex statistical model.
so let's segue into that space. You see a lot of what's going on in terms of adoption and where companies are in this adoption of AI. And I want to come to that, but let me ask you a more sort of fundamental question first, which is that what does it mean to be a leader in this era of AI?
Yeah, I wrote a piece about one of the best AI leaders that I have come across, who is Piyush Gupta at DBS Bank, the CEO of DBS Bank. And so the kinds of attributes he displays, I think, are a good model. He encouraged a lot of experimentation. He opened his wallet, as he puts it, to finance a lot of that experimentation. A lot of the early experiments at DBS were failures. They had an IBM Watson failure, and they hired I think it's called A-STAR, the Singapore National Research Lab, to do some AI development for them, and those were failures. But he kept going and made it a more, I would say, inclusive activity. He helped make decisions about where to put it. And, I was a little confused about how he had done this, because he was basically a banker for much of his life. But then I realized, you probably will connect with this as well. So we both have been around for a while, as you said. But he was John Reed's protege at Citi. And John Reed was, I think, really the first banker to realize how important information and technology were to financial services. And he set up a lot of the data structures for Citi in Asia. So he's participated a lot in the activity. You got to understand this stuff if you're going to really help make decisions about it. And he even participated. They did a little thing to get people going with this AWS Deep Racer car. I don't know if you've seen that. It teaches you reinforcement learning, and they had a little contest at DBS, and he participated, and he said, I didn't win, but I was in the top 10%. So he just really understands the technology, is willing to invest in it, make bets. I think, not always huge, big bang bets, but more intelligent bets. And he follows the progress of how people are doing with it.
So how do you prioritize projects as a leader? You're talking about sort of him opening up his wallet, creating a culture of experimentation. But how do you decide what to do? Like, of the range of projects that you could focus on, how do you decide how to prioritize things? Because there's a limited number of hours in the day. Things always take longer than you think. Things fail more often than you'd want. So how do you prioritize?
Yeah, well, I think his criteria, and smart organizations do this, change over time. So early on, he wanted to really encourage experimentation, and if you expressed interest, you could get some money to try it out. But he said later on, we started to insist that people had monetary returns. And well, I think if there is a big problem with AI in the enterprise, it's that there's too much experimentation that doesn't result in economic value. And so he's starting to insist on economic value. Planning for deployment from the beginning, I think, becomes important if you're going to be really serious and successful about this. By the way, I think you introduced me to a guy I'm working with on this return on AI issue. He was an Opera Solutions person years ago, and I think you introduced me to Opera Solutions.
Wow, that was like 15 years ago or something. Seems like forever. So, talking about Piyush, who I also read about in your book, I thought that was a really interesting case study you pointed out. And I've been sort of thinking about why it's taken so long for AI to sort of become more mainstream. And I say this because, I went to Wall Street in the 90s. I actually brought AI to Morgan Stanley and machine learning. And to me, it seemed at that time that machine learning was just around the corner, and I was clearly too optimistic. Why has it taken so long? And I ask this because at that time, it seemed to me that databases were beginning to happen. The internet was beginning to happen. So why has it taken so long for AI to sort of become a mainstream part of every business now? I should restate that, which is that why is it taking so long for AI to become mainstream? I don't know whether it's mainstream in every business, because I do want to talk about what makes some people sort of, pull the trigger earlier than others. But so let me rephrase that question. Why has it taken so long?
I think you could talk about the sort of technical reasons. We haven't had as much data, obviously, as we have now. We didn't have the kind of transactional systems in place to generate the data. We didn't have the internet to create all the data that it spews forth. We didn't have the processing power in most organizations. We didn't have the cloud, et cetera. But I think the bigger limitation is on the human side. We just didn't have enough people who really understood how all this works and cared enough about it to explore it further. I also wrote in the book, I'm sure you're familiar with this Morgan Stanley next best action system, which took a long time. I mean, over a decade to really come to fruition. But the vice chairman of Morgan Stanley, whom I haven't met, but he gets a lot of credit for this, said, I want a system that's like Netflix for making stock and bond recommendations instead of movie recommendations. And just seeing that was possible, or thinking that it might be possible, is what really drove that. And I think the sort of imagination and awareness is really the biggest lack that you see in companies today. Most executives just don't seem to have the ability to think that way.
Yeah, I was going to say that when I was at Morgan Stanley, I think to me it was a question of vision, right? That sometimes we are just so, I guess we sort of have blinders on that we forget that there are other ways of doing things. I mean, I remember a senior sales manager I worked with there, who expressed it really simply. He said, "Look, there's just a limited number of hours in the day, and you run out of time, and so it helps if you know who you should call with what proposition at what time." I mean, to him that was like absolutely critical, and it was just a simple vision, but no one had stated it. And then, once he did, we could then formulate experiments to see whether we could come up with an A/B test that would say, okay, we're going to approach these people with this thing at this time, and the rest of the people randomly, and see what happens. So, very often it's just sort of that lack of imagination, like you say, or the lack of vision, where we just don't realize what we can do if we decide to do it.
Yeah, and companies like Morgan Stanley have people who think that way. I was really interested in being the first to write an article in Harvard Business Review about these generative technologies. Unfortunately, my article came out about a week or two before ChatGPT came out, but there were other ones before that. And Jeff McMillan, who's the head of data and analytics for the wealth management business, had told me that they were thinking about using GPT-3 for knowledge management purposes, because they have all this knowledge about investing and how to handle different life events and so on within Morgan Stanley, but getting at it is quite difficult. And they realized, after going out to OpenAI and talking to them, that there might be some possibilities for that. And nobody else, I talked to a ton of other people, nobody else seemed to get that as early as they did. And it's still early days for that particular use case, but I think it could be really transformational.
Yeah, indeed. But by the way, talking about OpenAI, how do you think the stuff's going to get monetized, by the way? This Chat GPT-3 kind of technology. Do you think they're going to start charging for it eventually?
They say they have to, because it's very expensive to train these models, certainly, and probably just to run them day to day. They were charging. I had a GPT-3 paid account, and there's also a DALL-E 2 charge. So my guess is ChatGPT will also move in that direction. And I think OpenAI is doing a pretty good job of trying things out before they make it a production capability. They sort of, and they did that earlier with GPT-3 and DALL-E 2. They made it beta, and then they opened it more broadly. I think they've been bolder with ChatGPT because they think it has much broader application, but they do they encourage it to say, I'm not really intended to do this, if people ask for things that it can't do.
Yeah, I've just been sort of wondering about the barriers to entry with this technology. Like what's going to take for someone else to come up with something that's almost as good as GPT-3 and will cost almost nothing. Do you have like any sense of that at all? Like what the barriers
well,
might be?
there are already sort of open source versions of these generative tools, and my guess is they'll move in the direction of ChatGPT. So Hugging Face in France is one, and there are some open source text to image tools as well. So yeah, I think it may be hard to make a lot of money off of it because of the number of people that enter this space.
So, Tom, to come back to where we were a few minutes ago, which is what does it mean to be an effective leader in this age of AI? So, let's just come back to that, and let me ask you, so if you're I don't know, running an insurance company or a bank or whatever, pick your favorite examples. What are the two or three things you would focus on, and what are the things you would be wary of? And the wary of part is like, tell us about failures and why those have occurred.
Yeah, I think the uh, you have to have some basic understanding of what technologies are well suited to doing this. So if somebody came to you and said, "I have this great new idea for a rule-based system to, I don't know, underwrite insurance," and you'd say, well, excuse me, I would have entertained that proposal 20 years ago, but now I think there are better ways to go about it. You have to have some sense of what technologies can do what. And then I think you have to decide as an executive, is this an important business problem? And if it is, you should say, okay, I don't want to just experiment. I want to take this on the path to deployment. And the reason why a lot of deployments don't happen and companies just experiment with AI is because they're hard. It means changing the business process, integrating with the existing IT architecture, reskilling people, maybe gathering more data, making sure your processing will scale to those needs. I mean, some people have counted 100 times as expensive as just a little pilot. So, but I think that's the only way that you get any return from this. You don't get much return from just playing around. So it takes some pretty bold decision making, I think, to say we're going to do this in an entirely different way.
So you mentioned you referred to like playing around, and your book is called All In on AI, right? And I think you were if I were to reduce the your message to a single sentence, it would be stop pissing around, right? Just get
Yeah,
right, just
yeah.
get to it and
Stop tinkering is what they
tinkering.
call
Yeah,
the Cliff Notes version in Harvard Business Review. Stop tinkering with AI. Yeah,
yeah. So all in. So say a few words about what it means to be all in on AI.
sure. It's it comes from for me, my co-author as the head of AI at Deloitte, and they had an idea that companies needed to be AI fueled and so on. But for me, it came from the fact that I had seen this in analytics. I don't know, what, 15 or so years ago. And I wrote a book called Competing on Analytics, based on companies that were all in on analytics effectively, that really built their strategies around their analytical capabilities. And the same thing, I think, AI is even broader, more powerful than analytics as we knew them then. So there's more incentive, probably more risk as well. But it's companies who say, okay, we're to some degree at least going to bet the company on this technology. We're going to use it all over the business. We're going to have all sorts of use cases. We're going to educate a lot of people on how it works. We're going to change our business processes. In some cases, I think the most interesting cases to me in the book were the companies that have entire business models built on AI. And, we see this, by the way, coming back to Piyush Gupta, he says, the competitors of DBS are not, I don't know, Bank of China or other banks in Singapore or whatever. It's Amazon and Google and Facebook and so on. It's the digital natives and Baidu and the Chinese firms, Tencent. So those companies are quite comfortable with going all in on AI, and they did it a while ago. There's a book by Ash Fontana about being AI first. It's all about those companies. Marco Ianciti and Kareem Lakhani wrote a book about AI and analytics that's really mostly about digital native firms. So I was really interested in how the traditional legacy companies can make that shift. And so it requires a certain amount of boldness and a high degree of investment, certainly, and pretty good IT infrastructure, a lot of data, of course. I mean, it's data intensive businesses that are really the first to go all in, it's fair to say, like financial services and so on, retail. So, I mean, those are some of the attributes. But many of these companies had also done a fair amount with analytics. I mean, Capital One was always one of my poster children for being an analytical competitor, and now they're a poster child for AI, like over 1,000 different use cases.
Yeah, I mean, Capital One was interesting for multiple reasons, including the fact that they were willing to lose money to acquire data to improve their models, right? So that was one of the sort of really visionary investments that they made. I was also struck, you referred several times to Piyush Gupta. I was actually struck by that vision of sort of always being connected to the customer because, you have data and then you have data, right? But in his mind, it was, can you actually see if a customer is having problems using an app? With sort of that
Yeah.
level of sort of connectedness, which sort of struck a chord because, you can be collecting data, but analyzing it once a week or, periodically versus collecting data and analyzing it in real time.
Yeah, in my other book, if I can mention that, it's a set of case studies about people who work with AI on a daily basis called Working with AI. We did a case study. My co-author is from Singapore, is an academic in Singapore named Steve Miller, and he had some contact with them. We did a case study on what they call customer science at DBS, and that is, you're probably aware of this digibank that they created in India with no branches and so on. And in India, they created this application for interfacing with digibank for customer service. And they almost treat it as a personal failure if somebody actually calls the customer support line. Where did we go wrong? Following every step that customer took using the app to try to figure out why it didn't solve their problem, and using all sorts of analytical tools to figure it out. So yeah, it's a very well honed discipline, I think, for that type of organization.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to be a little facetious here, but many years ago, I decided to sort of, I guess, go all in on Google. That is, take a large position in Google because it sort of struck me they have no customer service and no desire to have any customer service. And I thought, how good a business is that? Where you said we actually don't want customer service because that's an indication that something is going wrong. So just eliminate that from the get-go.
Yeah, a lot of those digital native firms don't have any customer service, and I don't think it's always because they want to make their products so great that they don't need any. Sometimes I think they're just being cheap about it, but it's come back to bite them. What they don't spend in customer service, they have to spend on content moderation.
Indeed. Well put. So what about the flip side to my question, and that is the failures and what people should be wary of? Where do things go wrong?
Well, I think putting too much faith in a particular vendor can be a problem. I mean, in my previous book on AI, it's called The AI Advantage. I started it with three stories of big AI screw ups, and they were, I think, at least 2 out of 3 were all IBM Watson based. And it wasn't that Watson was a terrible technology, it's just that it wasn't up to all the hype that the company had created about it. So I think that's certainly one problem. I think not being open to learning. I was really interested in this Morgan Stanley situation where they sort of realized that, yeah, it's great to have a next best action recommendation system for clients about, what investments they should have, but they really studied quite carefully what was happening with their clients with the system, and it turns out what they really cared about was frequent, at least semi-personalized interaction with the financial advisor. And so over time, as I would talk to them, I would see, they talk less about having the perfect investing idea with machine learning and more about the financial advisor sending out things saying happy birthday, and by the way, a big storm is coming near your house and you might want to put down your hurricane shutters or whatever. So I think paying a lot of attention to how this is being used. And by the way, I think maybe this is a little off topic, but I think this is what good product managers do. And I've been writing a lot about the importance of product management in AI and even analytics applications. I guess the flip side of that is don't put just a data scientist in charge of doing this, because there are a whole lot of other disciplines necessary, including monitoring what customers do with it. And most data scientists, they're into the modeling and they're ready to move on to the next model after they've created one, not see it through to full deployment and watch it over time and how customers are using it and so on. So that's why you need data product management for these things.
Got to watch those data scientists, don't you?
No offense to you. I know you could probably call yourself that pretty easily. And I think it's great to have people who can fit models to data really well, but it's just, they're not the unicorns that maybe we thought they could be. And I may be partially responsible for this because I wrote an article with DJ Patil a decade ago that said in the subtitle that it was the sexiest job of the 21st century. But
that was great timing, by the way. It certainly was at that time. Probably still is one of the sexiest jobs, but seems to be cooling off a little bit given all these new tools that are coming into the picture.
Well, that and the fact that we realize we need all these other capabilities, data engineers, machine learning engineers, translators, product managers, machine learning operations people. So we still need them, but they're not all that we need.
So what do you see as some of the really interesting spaces, Tom, where AI, has potential? I mean, what do you think of the whole sort of genomics space? Are you on top of like what's going on there, with CRISPR and AI? Like, what do you see as sort of some potential there? That just seems like mind-boggling to me. And I actually, before you answer that question, I'll throw in another one. I tend to do that. I tend to throw in too many questions. But, I was thinking of COVID and when that happened and how Moderna just sort of came out of nowhere, right? And became a major sort of vaccine provider. And I'd never heard of Moderna. I don't know if you had, but somehow they seemed like a different kind of pharma company, right? They just seemed like, I don't know, at the risk of overstating, I mean, maybe they were like a tech company that was also doing pharma. So I put a lot in there, Tom. So just unpeel that in any way you wish.
Yeah. Well, as I understand it, and I've tried to pay a fair amount of attention to this issue, Moderna is a really interesting company, and their sort of parent, Flagship Pioneering, which is a kind of a combination venture and private equity company that creates different pharma-oriented businesses. They really believe that there are huge opportunities in using data and different technologies to change healthcare, and Moderna was just the first big hit. I think we'll see some other ones as well out of Flagship Pioneering. But as far as I can tell, AI itself was kind of useful on the margins at Moderna, but still quite early days for creating it. There had been a lot of RNA-oriented research, and I think both Moderna and Pfizer/BioNTech were fortunate that the timing just worked out really well. And they had been pursuing research that got started well over a decade earlier on RNA and had an idea that it could be very influential for things like this. And voila, they were right. But I do think that this whole area of genomics and personalized medicine and so on is way too complex for humans to master. And there are a fair number of companies that are starting to say we can use AI to recommend specific treatments. I actually wrote a little case study for this book working with AI on a cancer patient who was really quite aggressive in pursuing all the latest treatments, and he needed to because his cancer was quite aggressive. And I ended up talking to the people at Foundation Medicine, which is a company that will sequence your cancer cells and figure out exactly what the genomic makeup of them is. And then they eventually plan to use AI. Now they're using a simple form of AI, sort of rules-based, but when they get enough data, they're going to use machine learning to say, okay, you need this particular drug, and it's in this particular trial at MD Anderson or Dana-Farber or Memorial Sloan Kettering or whatever, and you better go right now. And we'll tell the oncologist, I mean, this is way too complex for any human oncologist to master all of this knowledge, exactly what to tell the patient, and maybe even give them a description of why that's the appropriate treatment approach. But I think we're still pretty early days into that. And, you know, the biggest advances in healthcare are probably in imaging, you know, radiology, using AI for image recognition. And still, there's not much. I just read a really interesting article about a New York hospital. I don't know, maybe you know which one it is. It's not named, where they had 3 different groups of radiologists using AI, and they had to use AI as a kind of second set of eyes to decide whether a lesion was cancerous or not. 2 were lesion oriented, 1 was bone age oriented, and 2 out of the 3 groups just blew off what the AI said because they couldn't understand it, and it didn't really make any sense for them to override their own judgment with an AI model that said that they were wrong if they couldn't understand why it said that. So I think we need to make progress in explainability, in injecting these tools into the clinical process. We have to get some regulatory approvals. We have to get insurance companies to pay for it all. So it's just taking a really long time to go into clinical practice, sadly.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned sort of this second set of eyes, and it reminds me of some of the work I've seen from the Center for Data Science here at NYU, some of my colleagues who've been looking at how a machine analyzes an image versus how humans analyze the same image. And it is very interesting because humans tend to focus on certain cues in the image, like contrasts and points and, you know, points of concentration and things like that. Whereas the machine seems to look at the image, the whole thing, even parts of it that the human may not think is relevant. And so, you know, it sort of gets back to this notion that humans and machines, quote unquote, understand the world or see the world in very different ways. And oftentimes this sort of second set of eyes is an interesting way to look at things, because it's not like you necessarily want to replace the human or replace human judgment, but you just want better information about the case from the machine that you might not have considered. Making it digestible is the hard part, as you point out.
Yeah, I think that what I've concluded after working in this space for, 7 or 8 years is that augmentation of AI by humans and vice versa is by far the most likely outcome in the vast majority of jobs and situations. And so we're making a mistake if we assume that, humans will be eliminated from the process. Earlier when you were talking, you said you thought machine learning was just around the corner, and you're probably quite familiar with Manuela Veloso, who was head of machine learning at Carnegie Mellon for many years and now is at JP Morgan Chase. And she said, I saw her at MIT a few years ago, and she said, when I first came to Carnegie Mellon in the 1980s, they said, fully autonomous driving just around the corner. If you want to go see it, it's just a couple of floors down in in the Robotics Institute building. It's really quite amazing. It's going to be on the streets of Pittsburgh any day now. And we're still saying that, right? So I think the companies that, like Toyota, that said, the primary value of this is not going to be replacing human drivers, it's going to be making them better, particularly really young and really old drivers. That's been their primary strategy, although they've explored a little bit full autonomy. It turns out it's too hard, too ambitious, and a vast amount of money has been probably, wasted on getting full autonomy before we were really ready for it.
Yeah, and I guess this whole area of full autonomy versus humans plus computers is sort of, I guess it's more complex than it appears on the surface, I'm finding, right? That we sometimes feel that surely human judgment added to a machine's decisions would improve it. And Kasparov certainly sort of promoted that view, when it came to chess, that humans plus a good machine would beat just the machine. But that seems more complicated.
For a while, that was true. For a while, that was widely believed, right?
It was
with
believed,
freestyle
yeah.
chess,
Yeah,
but not anymore, I guess, in chess.
Yeah, so do you have any more thoughts on when this is true and when it isn't? I mean, I've been fascinated by this question myself, especially in the area of sort of financial decision making, where you've got models and then humans say, I know better, and they override and the combination is worse. So do you have any thoughts on this as to when to augment versus when to replace? I mean, are there sort of, is there any pithy kind of insight here?
Well, I think there are two things. One is, is the decision a highly structured decision as it is in chess? There aren't a lot of external contextual aspects that really matter in chess. It's, what moves should I make and how's this going to play out on the chessboard? So that one's not surprisingly something that's better with full machine. And then the other is, I think we should treat it as an empirical question. I still remember I did a lot of research out at Harrah's and then Caesars when Gary Loveman, the former professor turned casino executive, was there. And he said, we put in an automated pricing system for hotel rooms at Caesar's Palace. And we initially said, humans, of course, complained a lot and said, this is the way we know our customers better, and they have a real situation demanding a price cut. We give it to them. And he said, fine, let's just look at how it works over time. If we end up making more profitable decisions online, with the algorithm, then but the humans will switch to just that and not let people override. Or what he switched to is, yeah, you can still override, but we'll fire you if you do. So we can monitor and see what are the quality of decisions made over some period of time, and then say, do we allow overrides or not?
So, talking about this, let's push on this a little bit more. To what extent do you find it difficult for businesses to experiment like that? Gary Loveman said, all right, we'll do an A/B test, right? And see which one turns out to be better. And maybe it's not going to be a horrendously expensive A/B test, right? We'll learn something from it. Do you find that businesses are really hampered by their ability to learn just because processes are too rigid to allow for experimentation and data gathering of this sort?
Well, I think there are several factors going on. One, some situations it's really, really easy, trying out different versions of a web page and seeing which ones get more clicks or whatever, very easy. A lot of companies do that. There are circumstances, I think, where managers believe that they sort of know the answer. And so why would I ever want to run an experiment on it? It might show that I'm wrong. So I think there's managerial ego that gets in the way. And then I think there are a lot of cases, particularly if you're talking about important decisions for companies where we just don't have enough data. A.G. Lafley at former CEO of P&G used to say, well, I'd love to use analytics on whether to buy Gillette or not, but we've never bought a company like Gillette. And there aren't other companies like Gillette out there. So it can't be an analytical decision. It has to be something that we ultimately have to, go with our gut on. So I think we need to understand what are the circumstances in which it's appropriate. And it turns out to be appropriate mostly for highly repetitive, tactical decisions on which we can collect data. And that's not everything that's important in companies. Gary Loveman, I think, was very good on those repetitive tactical decisions. He didn't do as well on decisions like should we get a gaming license in Macau, which he admits was a problem, or should we go private in a big private equity transaction in 2007 when the economy was just about to fall off the cliff. He says he had to do that or he would have been fired by the shareholders, but his really big decisions turned out to be a bit more problematic than the repetitive tactical ones.
So, Tom, in the time that we have left, a couple of other things I want to touch on, and one is sort of the employment scene, right? The impact of automation and AI on employment. Do you think that this is going to cause widespread unemployment, as is, that's a fear that's commonly expressed, and, and that might require universal basic income. Do you see that, that world as being a likely one?
Not anytime soon, I don't think. I don't see any evidence for it. All the companies that I talk to are, not doing it, or they're not doing it because of AI, if they are laying people off. Partly a function of technology. So, as it matures, that might become more of an issue. Organizations are slow to change. I don't know, maybe you've seen Jim Besson's research at Boston University that 30 years after we got online banking and ATM machines, we had the same number of bank tellers that we had before those things, because they just did other activities and banks opened more branches, and there were other factors around. We still have travel agents around in pretty respectable numbers, despite a lot of online tools for that. So I think it'll be very slow, and AI does tasks, not entire jobs, but it doesn't mean we can be complacent. And I think, if you're a marketer, you should really be on what ChatGPT can do for marketing, like a heat-seeking missile. So you can really master it. If you're a radiologist, you should be following developments in AI for radiology. I wrote a piece with a radiologist here in the Boston area, Keith Dreyer, who also has a PhD in AI, and his line was, only radiologists are going to lose their jobs to AI, or radiologists who refuse to work with AI. And I think we could extend that to, accountants and marketers and maybe even professors, God forbid.
So, you look at a lot of industries, through your connections with Deloitte. What are you seeing as the differences between the leaders and laggards in all of the spaces that you're looking at?
I think breadth and depth of AI use cases or applications is certainly one differentiator. Number of smart people they've hired to do this sort of work. Capital One tried to hire 5,000 machine learning engineers last year. It's I don't think they fully succeeded, but they're also training them internally if they can't hire them. I think, trying out new technologies. I think a lot of data scientists are not that thrilled with it, but I think some of these automated machine learning tools can make a big difference there and get data scientists out of commodity model development and, let them focus on what's really, really hard. So I think it's just always being aware of what technologies are out there, encouraging people in the organization to pursue them aggressively, looking at what new business models are possible. By the way, I think to me, the most interesting example in our book, All In on AI, is Ping An in China, where they have these 5 different ecosystems, all of which are driven by AI: healthcare, banking, insurance, automobile services, and smart cities, and just constantly thinking of new ways to use AI in all of those businesses. It's the largest private sector company in China and growing dramatically.
But say a little bit more about what it means for AI to be at the center of those 5 businesses. How did they do it?
Well, the Peter Ma, the founder, just believes it's really important. He hired a lot of really smart data science type to help him with it. Carnegie Mellon PhD as the head of it. Jessica Tan, who was an MIT master's student who worked at McKinsey for a while, is now co-chairman now. And so in healthcare, they realized that in China there aren't enough physicians, so it'd be really helpful to have some AI-based healthcare capabilities. So they built this system called Good Doctor, which now has over 350 million members that does intelligent telemedicine, triage, etc. And, tells you whether you need to come into the doctor's office or not, tells the doctor what's likely to be wrong with you, recommends a treatment strategy. It just simplifies the process a huge amount for areas where there aren't enough physicians.
So, Tom, actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, and I think this sort of fits well into the Ping An case, is the extent to which the advantage really lies in data, right? Because it seems to me that the business is really around data, right? And if you look at all of the internet giants, Google, Amazon, you look at all of these businesses that built tremendous valuations, they were off the backs of data, right? And when I look at Ping An, it seems to be a similar kind of situation, right? They got partners to agree to work with them, but in the process, they were really collecting data and sort of acknowledging themselves, for lack of a better term. And then it sort of becomes this sort of virtuous cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah, a Disneyland of data was how the head of data science described Ping An to me. So, yeah, and the other companies too. I mean, I talked a lot about Kroger in the book and their 84.51 degrees data science subsidiary. Obviously, Kroger, as the biggest grocery retailer in the US, has a ton of scanner data. They have a ton of loyalty data. Banks, of course, have had a lot of data. So I think you're right that data is a huge differentiator. But, there are ways to gather more data, and even consumer products companies like P&G and so on are trying to get more first party data, not having to buy it. That's been a huge disadvantage for them over the decades.
Many years ago, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I used to use this company called Faircast as an example of someone who just got ahead of the pack by just having data that no one else did, right? So Faircast, they'd scraped airline pricing data for years and could predict when the prices were going to go up or down, and actually even sell you insurance to lock in the price, which I thought was brilliant. And this is before Kayak and all even existed. And so I always sort of pointed to that as, to students as a case of there's just so much scope of being in the data business, like having data that's valuable that no one else does, and that you can actually start leveraging and building predictive models, and then sort of becomes a virtuous cycle.
Yeah. You and I picked the right field, I think, to focus on. Basically, every company is a data business. It's just that not all of them realize it yet.
Indeed. So, Tom, it's been fun. Thanks for being on the show. Before we wrap up, any advice to young people, students these days who are, entering the workforce in this sort of era of tech and AI? How should they think about the future?
Well, when we looked at these 29 case studies of people who are working with AI, the ones that were successful were these sort of aggressive adopters, the heat-seeking missiles. They explored new technologies as they came out, not just AI, but other, digital personal technologies, you can waste a little time on that. So they didn't go into all of them too deeply. But I think the only thing we know for sure about the jobs of the future is that they'll be more digital and more AI oriented and so on. So I think the more you can learn about how you can use these tools and add value to the decisions and so on that an AI system would make, the more employable you're going to be. And I think it may end up being the single most important advantage that someone has if they're coming out of school or whatever. Just how much have they been able to kind of delve into and master some of these technologies that would prove to an employer, they can learn new stuff all the time. And old guys like you and me need to do it too. I was just messing around with my first AirTags this morning. I thought, do I really need to do this? Yes, you need to do it.
I like the phrase heat-seeking missile. I'm going to use that a little bit more from now on. Like look for the hot spots. Where are the
Yeah,
hot spots these days?
yeah, exactly.
Seek
Yeah.
the hot spots. Good one. Well, Tom, it's been a pleasure. Is there anything we've missed that I should have asked you that I haven't?
Oh, I don't know. I'm so deeply into this topic that we could talk about it for days, I suspect. And I don't think so. I think there's plenty. But thanks for having me. You have a great podcast.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure chatting to you this morning, and we'll be in touch about a few other things offline.
Great. Thanks, Vasant. Great to see you.